Hello, everybody. My name's Jon Curtis. I'm the Academic Director of the Iran Heritage Foundation. A very warm welcome to all of you to this seminar this afternoon, which is about promoting cultural contact with Iran, showcasing Iran, and so on. And I should start by saying that this webinar was originally organized to coincide with a great forthcoming exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's going to be called Epic Iran, but due to the COVID situation, the opening has been postponed and it won't now open until late spring. But we thought we'd go ahead with this webinar anyway, because any discussion of Iran, cultural contact with Iran is important at any time. So we might as well, I think, do it now in advance of the exhibition. Well, this afternoon, we've got a very distinguished panel, which I want to introduce to you now. First of all, we have Jon Snow, who will be very well known to many of you, at least in the UK. He's on our screens most evenings on Channel 4 News, and he's always been a very persuasive advocate for Iran. And I should say that just yesterday, Jon announced that he and his wife were the proud parents of a new baby. So very many warm congratulations, Jon, on that. And it's great that you managed to find the time to be with us now this evening. Thank you so much. And then we have Neil Mcgregor, equally well known, I think, to most of you. He was the director of the British Museum from 2002 to 2015, and thereafter the director of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. And during his time at the British Museum, he was very active in promoting contact with Iran, and two major exhibitions were organized during that period, which we'll be hearing about shortly. And then we've got Dr. Vesta Sarkhosh Curtis, who is the Vice President of the British Institute of Persian Studies and also the Curator of Middle East Coins at the British Museum. And she has very extensive contacts with colleagues in Iran, and we'll be hearing about that in due course. We were to have had with us Dr. Maruk Tarapour, who was the Deputy Director of the Metropolitan Museum in New York and is now based in Mumbai. Sadly, she's indisposed today, not fortunately COVID related, but we wish you a speedy recovery, Maruk. And in the meantime, Maruk has written me an email, and I'd like to read out from a little bit of what she says in that email. She says, "I have long felt that Iran deserves a special kind of exhibition, one that through her history would show the breadth and depth of her contributions to the world. This is something more than ever today that our world and politicians need to understand, in art and architecture, of course, but also in music, poetry, language, science, warfare, and just about every sphere of life." I think, Maruk, we would all warmly endorse those sentiments, and I'm sorry you can't be with us this afternoon. Well, I think, I should just better say that please do type in your questions as we go along. We may consider some of them during the course of the webinar, or we may save them up till the end. We will see how it goes. But I'd like to start by asking the panelists why it's so important to maintain close cultural relations with Iran. As you all know, for 40 years, Iran has been in the news, really for all the wrong reasons for most of that time. So why now should it be important to promote cultural relations when it's been difficult during this time to maintain close political relations? And of course, underlying all this is the question of whether cultural contact helps to promote knowledge and understanding about Iran. So perhaps, John, I can ask you to lead on that one.
I think the first two words I would deploy in answer to that question is history and geography. I mean, the position, the placement of Iran in the world geographically is absolutely critical, I think. And the history, well, what country on earth can boast much deeper history than Iran, Persia? I must be personal for a moment. When I was a university student, went on a bus from Liverpool to Benares in India. I thought India would be the thing which would absolutely rest on my heart for the rest of my life. But actually it was Iran. Iran was an utterly, and remains to this day, a captivating entity. And the world is the poorer for not being able to engage in the culture and majesty of Iran. And in part, we brought this on ourselves, and in part, they brought it on themselves. And who hit first in bringing it upon anybody is anybody's argument. The truth is that it has remained a no-go place as far as the West has been concerned, or particularly the United States, who've taken the lead on it for 40 years, as you say. When I first went back in the 70s, first on that coach board and then latterly as a journalist, I remember the amazing sort of vitriol that was poured upon the Americans. You could pass the American embassy and there in large letters was "Crater is a dag and a donkey." That actually meant Carter is a dog and a donkey. But it was a splendid slogan. And poor Carter was the American president who was the least appropriate, really, to be so beaten up by events, global events that affected America and Iran in that way. He, I think, longed to have a relationship with Iran, but couldn't crack it. I mean, there's so much to be said about the whole story, but I was there a year ago today. I was in Isfahan, one of the most beautiful cities on earth, or absolutely wonderful. And they have this, all of you know, because you know so much more than I do, but this wonderful bridge. Is it 36 spans? It's anyway a very large number. A gorgeous place. And I was walking across the bridge a year ago and I saw these people in masks and I wondered what on earth was going on. And of course, Iran had got the virus just ahead of us. And by the time I got back to Britain, we too were wearing masks. But I think for a proper piece of scholarship on Iran, it would be better to turn to our experts, and I'll fill in later with the more emotional and, journalistic material. But I have loved every day I've ever spent in Iran, and that includes in police custody. It includes in the British Embassy. It includes. Here I am, 50 years a journalist, and the wonder and glory of Iran has never worn off. And I've somehow had to contain myself and not let too much of it hang out on air.
Do you think, John, that much of that glory gets across to the British public?
I don't think so. I really don't. I think the language used of Iran down the ages has been so awful. And the measures taken to contain what is perceived to be the great Iranian threat are so draconian. The sanctions, the military presence, and the words that have been used of Iran. Oh, clearly, I'm not sort of looking through rose-tinted spectacles. The Iranians have done plenty to, bring some of this about. But we should have been more mature than to let it get to us in the way the West has allowed it to get to us. We should have spotted the potential. And it wasn't for us to say that it couldn't be an Islamic state. It wasn't for us to say, get the church out of politics and all the other things that have been said of the Iranian regime. It's absolutely no paragon, but our job in life and in diplomacy and in the way in which the world works is to work together somehow. And not enough effort has been made to try and break through with Iran. And most of the present day attitude to Iran is born of fear rather than wonder. And if you let the wonder get to you, the fear would seep away.
Yes, there's very little understanding, isn't there, about what life is like in Iran, about the cultural heritage of Iran, how it is. There's a very negative view, basically, in the West, and very many people, when they go there, are hugely surprised by what they find. Was that the case with you, Neil, the first time you went there?
Well, it was, as I think you know, John. First time I went to Iran was with you. When you were the head of the Middle Eastern section at the British Museum, and with Vesta, and I was amazed and shaken by how misrepresented Iran had been in what I had heard in the media, or how much I had misunderstood it. And to go back to your question of why is it important to do this and engage culture with Iran, I think it's because it's the one thing that really matters, isn't it, is try to understand what the world looks like from somewhere else. What does the world look like if you're an Iranian, and what do they think about us? And I think one of the most striking things is that Iran has probably, in Western culture, been longest the victim of cultural black propaganda. I can't think of any comparable culture. And that's the fault of the ancient Greeks. We're all brought up with this great reverence for ancient Greece, and particularly Athens. And I'm sure I'm not the only person in this conversation today, this big debate, that first came across the Persians as the baddies against whom the plucky and brave, free, democratic Greeks had to fight. And that, of course, is very important, because Greek culture then constructed this idea of the Persians as the barbarians, the others. There's the first European real attempt to show non-Europeans as inferior, other, effeminate, cruel, untrustworthy. And that has gone on for such a long time that it's quite difficult, I think, and it's there below everything that's happened that John was talking about of the last 50 years. But what I found so disturbing, really, when I went to Iran was the level of my own ignorance about what Britain's role had been in the history of Iran in the last 100 years or so. And I think it's part of our problem about not just being ignorant about the story of the empire, but those countries that were never part of the empire, but that were so badly affected, deeply affected by British power. And the role of Iran in, particularly Britain in 20th century Iran, in blocking the development of a democratic Iran, because we were concerned with India and protecting India. And the way the Iranians had seen Britain, come to see Britain as the malign power, the power always trying to stop the good developments. And then, of course, in the Second World War, Britain and Russia simply occupying Iran and making all the decisions for it. I had never really known that. I certainly hadn't thought of that. And to discover in my first visit, those two things. Firstly, this history of a long empire that for hundreds of years had run from the Mediterranean to India, thousands of years, this culture at the center of the Middle East that made the Middle East. And then also this culture that had such a view of my country, about which I knew nothing. And that's, I think, what is so important, cultural exchanges can do to understand better what we think of each other, why we think it, and to get on to what John was talking about, that real understanding of what Iran actually is, how Iranians actually are, and how we could work with Iranian colleagues, as indeed we were able to do at the British Museum.
That's very interesting. Vesta, I know you've got a view about the perception of Iran in the West, and it does largely derive from the writings of the Greek authors, doesn't it? Nothing's much changed, even the 19th century accounts.
No, not just the Greek authors, but it sort of continues. The Romans did the same with the Iranian Parthians, and they sort of had the obvious enemy, the sort of the other on the other side of the Euphrates, which served them really perfectly. And then they continued. But it is also in the 19th century that Europe creates this very strong identity for itself and makes Greece and Rome the sort of the source of all the culture, European culture. And then there is very little time for anything that is in Asia, and for certainly the Iranians, they remain the baddies. But to go back to what Neil said about the perception or the sort of standing and the political interference of Britain has of course made it very difficult for those of us in Britain to work with Iranians and with Iranian colleagues. And the more important it is actually for us to see the achievements of what, for example, the British Museum has done, starting with Neil with the exhibition, but also sort of universities and funding bodies, like the British Institute of Persian Studies, various universities, Cambridge, York, to create contact with colleagues there. It's very important to make the people in Iran feel that they are part of the big scholarly world.
Can I just add to that? And Vesta, you've been talking, of course, about the academic world. We've both been talking about high culture. One of the things I'm most grateful to you for was making me read the very popular book, My Uncle Napoleon. Which I discovered is a book that all Iranians know. I think it was a television series as well. And yes. It really captures that sense of the general view of the British as the baddies. And the hero is this rather dotty uncle who is so anti-British that he decides he is really going to be Napoleon and fight the British. And it's a wonderfully humorous, light-hearted, clever, witty way of understanding just part of what the world looks like if you're Iranian, but also what Britain looks like if you're Iranian. And
absolutely,
it's that kind of understanding of the stereotypes. We grew up with one stereotype of Iran. They've grown up with the stereotype of us, and that's what it's also great fun to find out. But it's terribly important because these matter, as you say, they matter very much.
It matters very much, and to come back to My Uncle Napoleon. To this day, whenever anything happens, we Iranians say "Kar İngiliz ast." This was done by the English. So this is a term that we use all the time. Anything that happens anywhere in the world, the British must be behind it. And it's understandable. It's understandable when you look back, and also there's the sort of craving that we have to be accepted and to be acknowledged. And sort of when people talk about us, it's not just about, people, marching through the streets and shouting death to America or death to Britain, but to what we stand for, our language, our culture, and the youth, the future of the country.
Could I ask on that, and this is something also I'd like to ask John about, in that sense, what the Iranians think about us and what we have forgotten or chosen to forget. I mean, obviously, one of the great shocks to me visiting Iran first was how strong the memory of the Mossadegh coup, the anti-Mossadegh coup mounted by the British is. And that perception of the British as having blocked the chance of a democratic Iran in the 1950s.
One of the most informing things is the extent to which the overthrow of Mossadegh really is when many Iranians in this age think that is probably where everything was lost. Yes. But actually, in as much as Mossadegh could have ruled and could have led Iran in a secular and manageable way, was undone largely because the British didn't trust him, convinced that they would lose out, and the rest of it, and did all they could to support his end. Horrible. And he seems to have been a very, very remarkable man. And certainly you still meet them to the day. So today, some of the old ministers who worked for him, and they too were, quite remarkable people. And somehow there could have been, it seems to me, if that had been allowed to go forward, a much more manageable time for Iran. But instead, it became a conflict which was taken over by the Americans, who didn't understand anything about Iran, as far as I can tell, at all. I mean, incredible. And the seizure of the American embassy was almost preordained. The clash between Iranian life and American desire was very, very hard to roll back, and it has never been rolled back. And to this day, I mean, America's fear of Iran and conviction that it's about to terminate the world is just simply incredible. And the sanctions, the presence of fleets, of build-up of military to contain the great Iranian threat is extraordinary. And if even a tenth of the effort that goes into the military conflict were actually spent on diplomacy and trying to understand Iran, trying to understand what it's all, because how is it that we as citizens can go there and plug in and talk to anybody and everybody and not be molested by the authorities and the rest of it? Of course, yeah, if you put out a report and the government gets to find out about it and they don't like it and the rest of it, but that happens in many countries besides Iran. But we've screwed it up so badly. And I'm afraid one must point the finger at Iran, at America, for this. I mean, they've exacerbated what would have happened. They've made it much worse by their absolute hostility. And of course, it's such a dangerous thing in a region where there are two great beliefs. We are talking about two fundamentally different views of Islam, and interfere with that, and you really are playing with fire.
Yes, there's some very interesting comments coming through already. Of course, we knew that this webinar would be controversial, and indeed the comments support that.
Right off the street.
One of the first ones was from somebody who's chosen to remain anonymous, who says, "This sounds like fellow travelers visiting Stalin's Soviet Union and telling people that we need to understand them. The negativity vis-a-vis Iran, nothing to do with a lack of appreciation of their culture, it's to do with behavior in the rest of the Middle East." Well, of course, we all strongly disagree with that. And a very much more positive comment has come from Kirsty Schroff, who says, "As a scholar philosopher recently said, Greek philosophy ironically owes a lot to the barbarians, i.e. to the Persians, and that is most undoubtedly true. The contributions that the Persian made in the ancient world is actually enormous, and it's not totally impossible that the inspiration for the Parthenon might to some extent have come from Persia. This is the rebuilt Parthenon, obviously. And from Nelson Fernandez, who was the chair of IHS Contemporary Arts Committee, we have the comment, "My thanks to the panel for these thought-provoking contributions. We so often ignore at our peril the impact that our own imperial history has had on countries with illustrious histories such as Persia, Iran. We obviously all agree on the importance of reinvigorating cultural relations with a country such as Iran." Well, thank you for that.
John, could I comment on the first one, the anonymous one, please? I think it's a very important point. I mean, we've been talking about the need to try to understand why Iran feels the way it does about Britain. But I mean, it is important to remember, none of us would deny that we're all thinking, of course, about Mrs. Zaghari Radcliffe. None of us would defend the behaviors of the Iranian regime in a whole raft of areas. And none of us knows enough about what is happening in a place like Syria, which is now in the 10th year of the civil war. I quite understand the concern of that first comment. We've been talking about the misunderstandings and the ignorance about our own role in the past of Iran. That's not to be confused, I think, very importantly not to be confused with endorsing a great deal of what is being done by the Iranian government at the moment. And what we're talking about is relationship between people, individuals, and understanding the big context of the past, not about endorsing in any way some of these behaviors. John will have much more to say about that than I.
No, I mean, absolutely. And the the paranoia that our own behavior stokes in an already paranoid regime, is also unhelpful. I mean, I do think it would be possible for the West to find a pathway to actually speaking to the people in power in Iran. But for so long, the determination not to do that under any circumstances has really just left things worse and worse. And so you do get utter tragedies like Nazanin and then on a much bigger scale too of others who suffer at the hand of a paranoid regime. And I think paranoia in part plays a part in the Middle East as far as the Iranians are concerned as well, the Iranian government. I mean, it's time to try to understand these people and why they are as they are, rather than to say they're so beastly, they're not worth even talking to. Well, that's so true of many people. But we go on talking to Mr. Putin, for example, and we go on tolerating Belarus. But when it comes to Iran, sorry, no way.
Yeah, well, certainly, John, I think we all accept that the way forward really is to try and educate people around the world about Iran and ordinary Iranians and Iran's contribution to cultural heritage, which is huge. And obviously, that can be done in very many ways. We're only able this afternoon just to talk about a few of them, but it's important to recognize that many different institutions, universities, museums, foundations, and so on are working towards bringing Iran to the attention of people and to promoting a better understanding. And I thought we might now move on to the question of showcasing Iran in the United Kingdom. I should perhaps say, first of all, that there have been a number of exhibitions about Iran since a great one in 1931 at the Royal Academy, which really put Iranian art onto the map in the first place. But since then, there have been a number of exhibitions, not many of them dealing with the whole history of Iran, but focusing on certain aspects of it. Recently, those exhibitions have been able to bring material from Iran. There have been exhibitions in Bonn, in Germany, at Lens in France, in the Louvre outpost, and also the Drents Museum in Holland. But for the last few years, it hasn't been possible to bring anything from Iran because of sanctions and the impossibility of getting insurance cover. But before all that, as I mentioned at the beginning, the British Museum organized under Neil's directorship two very successful exhibitions. One was called Forgotten Empire, about the Achaemenid period, the Persian Empire period in Iran, and the other was about Shah Abbas, the remaking of Iran, and that was in 2009. So perhaps you could tell us, Neil, why you organized these exhibitions, and more importantly, What did they achieve? What do you think the impact was?
Thank you, John. The purpose of doing the aim was what I was saying earlier on, but I think the purpose of the British Museum is, and exhibitions of this sort, is to try to make it easier to understand what the world looks like for somewhere else. And I think not enough people, certainly I hadn't in Britain, understand that Iran knows that it is the heir of an enormous and ancient imperial tradition, that for thousands of years, Iran has been the central cultural and often military power of the whole of the Middle East. And particularly that early Achaemenid empire, the empire that was the one with which the Greeks came into contact. So it seemed, as I found out a bit more about it, I realized that this is something very few of us study in school, other than from the point of view of ancient Greece, and very few, of course, at university. And that it seemed important to try to address this because Iran was ancient Persia. Persia was the first land empire of great scale. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, here was an enormous empire that depended on roads, not rivers, and that accommodated a great range of religions and languages. So in a sense, the ancient Persian Empire is the first empire, the first state to try to address what it means to have a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-faith society. And the more I found out about that, the more interesting I thought it was. And the more valuable to try to explore how ancient Persia tried to address that. And that meant, of course, trying to negotiate loans from Iran. And there, of course, you and Vesta were both extremely important in those conversations. And a couple of things came out of that, to my mind, very strongly. The first was how much personal friendships mattered. I remember when we were going to ask for the loans, it was just after the invasion of Iraq by the British and the Americans. And I assumed that the whole exhibition would be cancelled. And in fact, what the Iranian authorities made clear was that because you were their friends, they would go ahead. This was an act of friendship that was separate from the political. And that takes me back to that first comment, that this is one of the reasons why these kind of connections are so important. It shows what friendships can achieve. The second thing that I remember very clearly from those discussions was the great nervousness of some Iranian officials, the nearer one got to central government, that if valuable things were lent to London, they wouldn't be returned, and that it would be foolish of them to trust the British government after this long history of hostility and my Uncle Napoleon's kind of views. And particularly one of the great loans for the exhibition about the empire of Cyrus, the Achaemenid Empire, was the silver tablet, the foundation tablet for Persepolis, one of the great treasures of Iran. And a serious debate that if it was lent to London, it wouldn't come back. And I was very moved by the fact that the cultural authorities and the minister involved were prepared to take the political risk of lending such an important object, a great national symbol, without being entirely sure that they had absolute confidence in it coming back. So that was my great memory, was how much can be achieved by friendship built up over years, the way you had, but also how much can be done slowly, small gestures, small steps, to get over what John described quite rightly as that paranoia and that history of mistrust. And the question for all of us has got to be, how do we start dismantling that history of mistrust on both sides? And the making of that first exhibition was, to me, very it was very difficult, it was very hard work, lots of details and difficulties, but it was a demonstration, I think, of what can be achieved if you have those relationships of friendship and of trust.
Hmm. What was fascinating for me about the Forgotten Empire exhibition back in 2005 was actually how popular it was. It was clear that there was a hunger for finding out about Iranian culture. And I remember that you one day said to me, great surprise, there's a queue round the block for the first time since the Tutankhamun exhibition.
Exactly. This was the great astonishment, because I wasn't sure whether people would want to come. Not many people knew very much about it. But in fact, well over 150,000 visitors came and really engaged. There was a great deal of discussion in the press, media, about ancient Iran, about the connections between ancient Iran and the Middle East today, because what I think many people understood for the first time was that the region that we call the Middle East today, from Egypt, Turkey, Eastern Mediterranean to India, Afghanistan, that is, of course, the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire that makes that one region where people are in contact with each other, where for centuries people went on reading in Persian, and whereas the Alexander Empire didn't last a generation, that empire lasted for hundreds of years and has shaped the world today, that the Middle East today is what it is and is in some sense a unit because of that Persian Empire. And I think that was something that emerged from that exhibition at a much higher level of public consciousness. Obviously, many people had known that all the time, but for me, and I think for many others, that was really a discovery, how much Persian Iranian influence had shaped the region to this day.
Yes. Well, there's a very large number of comments coming in. And actually, I have to say that nearly all of them agreeing with you panelists that, there needs to be a better understanding of Iran on a cultural level. I can't see anybody that actually agrees with our first respondent. But anyway, we'll pass that. There's an interesting comment here from Charles Melville, who was formerly the E.G. Brown Professor of Persian in Cambridge. He's now the president of the British Institute of Persian Studies. And he's making a political point. I think this will interest you, John. He says, one wonders what it takes to make the parties involved in the latest nuclear argument see that Iran has every right not to accept the West demands, that Iran keeps to their side of the nuclear agreement when the West have not kept their side.
Well, I hesitate even to attempt to walk in the footsteps of so erudite a questioner, but it is a good question. And, if you don't understand where Iran is, both politically, diplomatically, and geographically, and I'm afraid an awful lot of people don't, then it's very difficult to understand why they might want to be to have some degree of, high-tech defense. I think what worries me is that all the experts that used to be in the Foreign Office, that used to be on the benches even at Westminster, have kind of evaporated because nobody is investing any longer in being expert in that region, or very few people, because they don't get any great kudos for it, because it's a kind of written off region in a way. It's not where the world is going to be shaped, and that's wrong. I think it's a huge mistake to do that. There are so many balances and counterbalances when one thinks of moving on to India and China. Persia, Iran is a very important place as we move onward towards our own homeland. And my sense is that you can't have a holistic, diplomatic and problem-solving world if you're not invested in that region, and too many people are not. There was a time when the British embassy in Iran was the biggest, and indeed had it was seen as a definite, good posting to get. Now, of course, that was in the 50s and the rest of it. And now, it's only the most dedicated diplomats who learn Farsi, who study the history and want to be part of a new outlook on the whole region. Because, like it or not, whatever their behavior, the truth is the Iranians, I mean by this, the Iranian authorities, need allies. They need us to some extent, because we do have, as Neil has illustrated, and of course, as both John and Vesta Nesta do illustrate all the time, we do have great expertise in that region, and we should use it.
Vesta, have you got any comment about promoting a better understanding of Iran in this country through exhibitions and other means?
I think so. I think, exhibitions are important because they bring in an audience. They bring people who learn about the country, the culture on the spot through the objects. But it's equally important also for universities and research institutes to sponsor Persian and also spend money on the culture, language, history of the Iranian Persianate world. And I think in that respect, there are some institutions like the British Institute of Persian Studies or the Iran Heritage Foundation, quite a few of them, who have a very difficult task because there isn't all that much money available, and they still sponsor and fund scholarship because, as John said, the less money we spend on Persian languages, Persian culture, the less specialists we'll have at the end of the day. And there is actually, it's very important at this point to encourage young people to study Persian and Persian culture.
Yes, so a nice comment here from Isabel Miller, who says, agree with much of what is being said. Iran was and is a marvelous place and has a wonderful history and fabulous culture. I think we can all agree with that. I'd just like to turn now to another exhibition, Neil, which you were very much involved with, and this was sending the Cyrus Cylinder first to Tehran and then to the US. It was a very bold thing to do, if I may say so, and it was great that you managed to get the agreement of the trustees for that. It was seen by, we are told, 500,000 visitors in Tehran when it was in the National Museum. Then sometime after that, in 2013-14, it went to the US. It opened at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, and at that time, the Cyrus Cylinder was actually displayed on a huge electronic panel in Times Square. The first time, I think, that any ancient artifact has been accorded that privilege, and attracted an enormous amount of interest. And we're told that it generated 1.37 billion media impressions. And this exhibition, actually is supported, I have to say, by the Iran Heritage Foundation, moved on to 5 different venues in the US. After Washington, it went to Houston, where the exhibition was opened by a Mobad, a Zoroastrian Mobad, a priest, then to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, then to the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, and lastly, Los Angeles. But that wasn't quite the end of the tour, because after a short lapse, it went to Mumbai in India, where it was shown at the CSMVS Museum. So perhaps, Neil, you could tell us something of your impressions of the tour and how impactful you think it was.
Thank you, John. this really was the, if you like, the return match for the Iranians having the confidence to lend the silver foundation tablets from Persepolis, something of supreme importance, that there was nervousness about whether it would come back or not. And they had made that gesture to the British Museum, and they asked if in return they could have the Cyrus Cylinder, this document of Cyrus's decision after conquering Babylon to let the conquered people, the slaves, go home, taking their religious vessels and utensils with them, their cult objects with them, and that, of course, which allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. An enormously important document for the Middle East, the whole Middle East. And it's an interesting point here, what museums can do, what cultural things can do when governments are not on good terms. And it's one of the huge benefits, I think, of the British system of trustee museums, which are not government controlled. The autonomy of the British Museum and the other national museums in Britain. Because in 2010, when the Cyrus Cylinder went to Tehran, diplomatic relations could hardly have been worse. But it seemed to all of us very important that these personal, professional relationships should be maintained, and also that just as people in London had been able to find out about Iran from the exhibition, people in Tehran should be able to find out about the Cyrus Cylinder. It was a very brave decision of the trustees of the British Museum. I mean, because again, there were many voices in Iran saying if it comes, we won't let it go back, and so on. And yet it went and it came back. What did it do? Well, I think in Iran, it did demonstrate that that we had reciprocated with an act of trust as they had to us. But above all, it allowed the Islamic Republic to think about its pre-Islamic history and the role that Iran was playing before Islam and the values that Iran represented before Islam. And one of the things that I found most moving was the way that the government in Iran talked about Cyrus as embodying many of the values and ideals that are shared by the prophets of the Jewish and the Christian and the Islamic tradition, talking about Cyrus as a prophet. That to me was an extraordinary way of linking the pre-Islamic and the Islamic and the Islamic and the Jewish and the Christian from the government, that struck me as really interesting and well worth the whole venture. So that was the Iranian side. And I have to say I was extremely nervous about whether it would come back, because one could well imagine many convinced people in Iran feeling this was part of Persian narrative, Persian history that should stay, but it came back perfectly as promised. It then went to the United States, and that was very fascinating. One of the things we were able to focus on in the United States was the standing that Cyrus had in the 18th century in the European Enlightenment as the ruler who worked with different religions. Here is Cyrus, possibly a Zoroastrian, conquering Babylon. In the name of the gods of Babylon, he allows the Jews to return with their cult objects to the temple. And in the book of Isaiah, he's described Cyrus as being guided by Jehovah. This is a notion of different religions, the state accepting them all, working with them all, that hugely appealed to the 18th century. And in Washington, the Cyrus Cylinder was exhibited beside Jefferson's own copy of Xenophon's Cyropedia, Xenophon's study of Cyrus, with Jefferson's annotations in the margin. And I think for many people in the US, that was a great surprise to discover that the American Constitution was in some way connected to, indebted to the ideas of ancient Iran, ancient Persia. That was a very I found that a very moving moment because it reminded us all of the connections that what we share. And then obviously elsewhere in Iran, in the US, it was particularly welcomed by emigre Iranian communities, which they felt very valuable to show to their friends what Iran was. And then finally in Mumbai, something quite different, because there Cyrus is seen, of course, as a Zoroastrian, the Parsi religion. And the link with Iran for the Parsis, who played such a big part in the life of Mumbai, is a very strong one. And that Zoroastrian morality, very clearly articulated morality, a monotheism with no representations of God, but high moral values. They saw that as being embodied in the Cyrus Cylinder. So there's one object meaning different things in different places, but always making connections that were not the connections of 593 BC, 539 BC, but are real connections today. And that was a very powerful thing. See how that object can go on, taking on new meanings, and what Cyrus can represent as an ideal all around the world at the moment.
Yes, thank you, Neil. It's ironic, isn't it, to think that Cyrus may have actually had some direct influence on the thinking of the founding fathers of the United States. But I just want to move on to another.
Can I just pause one moment just to say that what you have witnessed is something you could never pay enough money for, and that is to listen to a force that is amazingly gifted with imagination, creativity, scholarship, diplomacy, determination, and a whiff of the daredevil. That is Neil, and that is what got the Cyrus Cylinder to Tehran. It was an unbelievable achievement and a most extraordinary gift to humankind, and it will never be forgotten.
Yes, well, I think we'll all endorse that, Jon.
Yeah.
I'm coming back to you now because there's an interesting point here from Norman Hammond, who's the archaeology correspondent of the Times. It's partly an answer to Charles Melville's point, and he says, "We don't appreciate that Iran is surrounded by nuclear-armed neighbors, Israel to the west, the US Sixth Fleet in the Gulf, Pakistan and India to the southeast. Iran's desire for parity is understandable."
It's a very sound point, and you're very aware of it when you're there. It's impossible not to see the issue through Iranian eyes when you are there. Look, I know all the shortcomings, I know all the dangers and everything else, but you are very, very aware that you're absolutely in a crucible of tension, of competition, of real danger of explosion. And in some way, we have to understand that. We have to understand where the Iranians are coming from. And it isn't good enough just to sort of ride roughshod over their concerns, because there are real forces that are a very grave danger to the Iranians, and in fact, some of those forces are quite a danger to ourselves. And I think that is sometimes one or two of the issues that bring us a little bit closer together.
Yes.
Could I add to what Jon's just said? And Jon talked earlier about the British Embassy in Tehran. And when you visit there, of course, one of the things you're shown are the photographs of the Tehran conference. And I find this very interesting. In Britain, we're still enormously conscious of the impact of the Second World War and what that did for our understanding of ourselves and our relation to the world. What happened in Iran in the Second World War was that Iran was not at war with anybody, and it was occupied by the Soviets and by the British without ever having been at war. And the world was sorted out in Tehran without any Iranian present at that conference. And those memories are presumably just as deep and as strong in Iran as our memories of the 1940s are here. And just as those memories shape the politics of our government at the moment. The rhetoric of so much of our government is still shaped by those memories of the 40s. I think we shouldn't be surprised at all that it's still so present in Iranian memories. What it means if you are not able to defend yourself against people who decide they will do what they want.
Yeah. I'd like to turn back to culture now, or there's been very fascinating having this political discussion. There have been a lot of points actually about how cultural contact can be maintained. There's a question from Armin Yabari asking if there's an appetite for digital collaboration in Iran, which is an interesting point. But what I'd like to ask Vesta is how can cultural, apart from exhibitions, how can cultural contact and awareness best be promoted? I mean, one might cite as examples a recent initiative of the Iran Heritage Foundation, which was a series of conferences about Tapis-Sialk, which we organized. We were asked to do so actually by Iranian colleagues. And there's also, isn't there, the coin projects, which you've been involved in with colleagues in Iran. Could you tell us a little bit about those?
Yes. I mean, there are several research projects going on between universities here in the UK and universities and museums in Iran. And to cite an example, my coin projects, the 2 coin projects that Neil very much endorsed. And if you remember, Neil, we went out to Iran a couple of times and we discussed it, and both Neil and also the present director of the British Museum, Hartwig Fischer, supported these 2, particularly the Parthian coin project, enthusiastically. And it sort of shows that you can cooperate with colleagues. In Iran, you publish collections, and these are very much valued by colleagues in Iran. And as I said, it's sort of, there are quite a few of them in universities like York University, Cambridge University, SOAS. So that's very important to keep in touch with colleagues. The only problem is that through the sanctions in the last few years, it's become very difficult to bring colleagues over to the UK. It's not just a question of organizing visas, but people who come here, they can't have bank accounts, they can't be paid. It's, you know, you get into all sorts of problems. So the more important it is really to get rid of all these problems and to make it more easy for colleagues in Iran and in the UK to work together. Absolutely.
Yes, and as an example of working together, we might just refer to Restitution of Antiquities. Very recently, a collection of 55 wonderful painted bricks from a site called Bukhan were returned to Iran. They arrived there back at the National Museum just before Christmas. They had been illegally exported in the 1980s. And thanks to the efforts of a lawyer and others here and in Switzerland, it was possible to send them back. And gestures like this, I think, are very helpful, in fact. Now, coming back again to the questions, yes, this one I wanted to focus on. This is from a colleague in SOAS, Sarah Stewart, who says, and this is really a question for all of you, but particularly for Jon, why do you think so many journalists in the media, not you of course, Jon, but others, portray Iran in such a negative light?
I think that they have drunk the Kool-Aid of the, the prevailing political and diplomatic language. But to be honest, I was just thinking about the media and Iran. You know, when I go, almost invariably, well, for sure, there'll be no American reporters or crews there at all. That's partly because the Iranians may not give them visas and the rest of it, although I don't think that's the key to it. I think they're actually somewhat worried about going. But the media interest in Iran is flat. Occasionally you get something wonderful like the Cyrus Cylinder and people perk up their ears and the rest of it, or there's some terrible, security threat, and they do go. But the consistent coverage and reportage of Iran is very low, and so the chances of really challenging the overall picture that is peddled of Iran is very small. And I think what this whole talk this afternoon has told us is the amazing role in culture in really bringing truths to people's tables, where they've often been deprived of any other source of real information. And I think that is why these exhibitions have been so successful. People are quite hungry to drink this sort of Kool-Aid.
John, can I just say something here? May I?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, please.
I think you're absolutely right, John. Therefore, also, it was very important to see Samira Ahmed's program. I think it was absolutely refreshing, and it has so many people who had no idea of Iran. What the program, BBC program, and she did a fantastic service actually to Persian culture with that series of films.
It was very clever because she didn't pretend in any way to be an expert. And what happened was that you saw her constantly reacting to
absolutely, yes.
Instead of saying, "Oh, I've been told that there's a 4th century BC item here that we must try and film." No, she just let it all hang out and really enjoyed it. I thought it was a very clever decision to go with it.
And that's also very important, in addition to exhibition, conferences, publications, to have programs about Iran.
Yeah, I think, can I just add, John, I mean, that's of course entirely true. I mean, the television programs were marvelous. The thing we haven't yet mentioned, of course, is the contemporary Iranian material that's being collected and exhibited in London. The V&A has been working very hard on this, particularly on the photographic side, I know. And those exhibitions, those objects, which I'm sure will be in the exhibition and visible around it, they make it so clear how much diversity, how many different approaches to thinking are actually present in Iran at the moment and can be articulated in spite of the repression and the difficulty.
That's so important because, when we were in Isfahan, people came up to us and talked, and you can be seen from either end of the bridge. But there was no sense of fear of people, being lifted for talking to a Westerner. You're absolutely right. Sorry, I interrupted.
Because we've been talking about the past, but actually the contemporary material that's going to be exhibited in London and is available in the British Museum and in Victoria and Albert is really important, I think, for this changing understanding.
Yes, there's an interesting comment actually from Nelson Fernandez, whose previous question I read out. He's saying, as you know, he works in the field of the performing arts, and he's saying, what advice might the panel have to those working in the fields of drama, music, puppetry? How can we restart that dialogue? And this is a very interesting point, Nelson. Thank you for that. And there's a very positive comment from Professor Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones in Cardiff, who says that current GCSE and A-level courses in ancient history and classical civilization have incorporated Persia into the curriculum.
Oh,
that's a great
very good, brilliant.
Lloyd, and thank you for telling us. Well, we were scheduled to last for 1 hour, so we're over that already. We'd better stop soon. But I just want to ask each of you if you've got any closing comments. Who wants to start with this?
Can I just start?
Yes, please.
I'd just like to remind Neil of the Cyrus Cylinder exhibition in Tehran. I don't know whether you recall the scene when the exhibition opened and people came to see this one iconic object in the hall upstairs, how people walked back, not with their backs to the object, but they sort of walked back facing the object because they wanted to show their respect. And this is something that I will never forget, and I will take it always with me, the sort of not just enthusiasm for the exhibition, but also the respect for Cyrus and the Cyrus Cylinder.
And being in the presence of somebody royal, isn't it? You have to walk backwards.
Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to say exactly that, and I was very struck when I went back to Tehran later to see that there's a large plaque at the museum recording the visit of the Cyrus Cylinder, exactly the way in Britain you might record the visit of the sovereign.
Yes.
Exactly that. My final remark is really, I think, to say wish the Victoria and Albert Museum good luck with this exhibition. It's more important than ever to put on this kind of exhibition, and it's probably harder than ever because loans from Iran at the moment are quite out of the question. So it's really a very strong round of applause to the V&A for doing this, and hoping that it will achieve what we all hope.
And I'd like to give a strong round of applause to Jon and Vesta and Neil for really the most fantastic opportunity to wallow in Persia. Wallow.
That's the word.
And not many people will admit to wallowing in Persia, but as you described, there have been many, many moments, most climactically, obviously with the Cyrus Cylinder, but the bad mouthing of all that is Persian, all that is Iranian, in a sense, in a tabloid world and in a quick clip on the internet, doesn't do justice. This is a complex, beautiful, extraordinary country with some very real problems, enormous problems. And we have enormous problems resolving those that affect us and them. And I think what we've done today speaks to the need to understand each other and to relish each other's beauties and not to wallow permanently in our disagreements and fears.
Well, thank you, Jon, and thank you, Neil and Vesta as well, for what's been, I think, a really fascinating discussion. We're also grateful to all of you who've sent in comments. There've been so many of them. It'd be quite impossible to read them all out, but perhaps we'll be able to collect them together and put them online or something like that. So I'll just close by reminding those of you who don't know that IHF's next event is on the 19th of March, when we're going to celebrate Nowruz. We won't, as usual, I'm afraid, be able to do so in the plush surroundings of the Grosvenor House Hotel, but we will be doing it in an online webinar. So that will be actually on Nowruz itself is in the early hours of Saturday morning. So I hope as many of you as possible will be able to join us then. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.